Vaccine questions grow as COVID variants spread. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Mark Weaver, Republican strategist, Herb Asher, OSU political scientist, and Jackie Borchert, bureau chief for the Ohio USA Today network. Governor DeWine says the COVID-19 vaccines are Ohio's ticket to freedom, but the sales pitch took a hit this week when health officials basically pulled one of the vaccines out of circulation. The FDA and the CDC recommended a pause in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine after 6 women were sickened by blood clots. 1 woman died. The 6 cases were out of nearly 7 million doses administered, but it was still enough to suspend the vaccine's use. The news intensified fears of vaccine skeptics, but the governor and health officials maintain the vaccines are safe and now needed more than ever as cases continue to spread in Ohio, in particular Franklin County, which returned to purple status this week, which signifies severe spread.
What we're seeing in Franklin County is we're seeing in many other counties in Ohio, and that is a strong variant, a variant that is multiplying very quickly, a variant that is more contagious than what we have seen in the past. So we have this dichotomy, really, of a lot of people in Franklin County are now vaccinated. A lot of people aren't going to spread it. A lot of people aren't going to get it. We're making it harder and harder for this variant to multiply, but at the same time, it's so powerful that it is multiplying.
Jackie Borchert, back in the day, if a county went purple, in particular schools would shut down. That's not going to happen in Franklin County. We're basically just going to try to get people vaccinated, correct?
Correct. That map was introduced in July. And I think very quickly, even though the state didn't put out any sort of mandates or policy changes tied to it, we saw lots of school districts and businesses and other entities that kind of relied on that color coding system. Since then, I think many of those entities have backed away from the color coding system. The governor himself has even kind of downplayed it in recent months and preferring to show a chart of the case rate. So new cases per 100,000 residents in the last 2 weeks. And he made special notice on Thursday to say that even though Franklin County is high on that indicator, there are more than a dozen other counties in the state that are higher than Franklin County. And the second point I would make on the school issue is at this point, all the school districts have been offered the vaccine, and all the teachers and staff members that took the vaccine would be fully vaccinated. Now, that's a point that Lieutenant Governor Jon Husted raised, that he doesn't expect schools to close with changes in this map, or even as we see more spread maybe due to these variants, because the vaccines have been shown to be protective against these new variants. And that was one of the reasons why Ohio prioritized vaccinating school populations.
Mark Weaver, this isn't the way it was supposed to work. We saw the cases declining dramatically back in February. The vaccinations were going up. Now we're seeing spread high. We're at 4 times what the governor says, the rate of new cases. The governor says we need to lift all the health orders.
Well, we know that we know that viruses mutate, and we know that people can let down their guard. The good news is, though, many more people are being vaccinated, and these vaccinations are very powerful, better than 90% immunity against a virus that has better than 95% survival rate. So although we're still seeing spread, I think Ohioans feel as though we've turned a corner, and they can certainly see the light at the end of the tunnel for life getting to be much more normal.
Herb Asher, getting to that number, the governor said that when we get to 50 cases per 100,000 population for 2 weeks, he would lift all the orders. And he actually had hoped to do this by 4th of July. Now we're at 4 times that rate because of this surge of sorts that's happening right now. Does he regret setting that number, or is there still hope that this will come back down just as quickly as it's gone up?
It's probably good to set a standard that you're trying to achieve. But, look, as I think as Mark said, and as Jackie said, if you look at the news, overall, the news is fairly good. But whenever you now have a news story that says so many more people are vaccinated, but the rate is just going up in Franklin County or in Michigan or whatever, I think there are a lot of people who really still get perplexed about what's happening here. And I think some people are worried that this might make the anti-vaccine people even more reluctant to get the vaccine when they hear about the Johnson & Johnson. I think we need to understand here that we're now on a trajectory where every week that goes by, a higher percentage of Ohioans will be vaccinated. And that means that there'll be fewer of us who, in fact, can transmit whatever new variant comes up. And I think the last point here, Mike, is that most of the scientists are saying that the variants are likely to be, you'll be protected from most of the variants by being vaccinated. You won't get sick. You might still have a chance of transmitting something, even though you're not sick. And the imponderable is, could there ever be a variant that is truly scary?
Yeah.
And we don't think so. But when you say we don't think so, the word think is the operative.
Yeah, Jackie Borchert, the governor, he was trying to be very positive the day that he had a special news conference, the day the J&J vaccine was put on pause. And he and his health advisor were really trying to be positive. But he did say that he's had better days, and it just really sort of undercut his message that to get the vaccine, to have even a shred of doubt about one of them.
Right. And I mean, that's a problem that goes beyond Ohio. I think when that announcement was made, we had public health experts on both sides of that argument saying, the CDC and the FDA were being overly cautious, given that it was only 6 out of nearly 7 million. And you had other experts who were saying this is absolutely the right call, because with something new like this, that is, you're going to find cases, though, as your pool widens, even though the trials were very large, they weren't in the strength of millions. And so if you have something that is extremely rare, which this blood clot issue seems to be, if it is linked to the vaccine, it's extremely rare. At least they are finding it and studying it now before you're vaccinating even more people. And in Ohio, there were 264,000 Johnson & Johnson doses approximately administered before this pause. And that was about 6% of the total doses administered in the state. Most of Ohio is getting either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. So it already was, not the majority of Ohio's supply. And we were expecting less of that anyway in the coming weeks. But it certainly, threw a wrench into some of these colleges' plans to inoculate their students before they leave and go home, wherever that may be.
Yeah. Mark Weaver, here are the stats. 36% of Ohioans have had at least one shot. 24% of Ohioans are fully vaccinated. We rank 32nd out of the 50 states in terms of people who've had at least that first dose. It seems, of all the demos, there's skepticism across all the spectrum of society, but Republican men tend to be have been the most skeptical of this. Will they be even more skeptical because of this Johnson & Johnson news?
Potentially, but I think the real indicator of why there's so much vaccine concern is that this issue was politicized by members of both parties, kind of irresponsible people in both parties throughout the last few years. And as a result, if you're making an issue political, people will retreat to their political corners and take their normal political views, which is a shame, because this is a public health issue that shouldn't be politicized. But like everything else in modern America, and has been for better than 10 years, nearly everything has become political.
All right. Those hundreds of thousands of Ohioans who have lost their jobs last spring are starting to get back to work, but the state still has to pay back all of the money it borrowed to pay unemployment benefits. The state owes the federal government $1.4 billion. The state plans to use some of the federal COVID relief money it is getting from the federal government to repay the federal government. But the problem remains. In recent years, the state has not had enough money to pay unemployment benefits during a recession. Herb Asher, first to the repayment of the loan. Does it make sense to use federal money to repay this loan rather than maybe increase taxes or cut benefits?
When I heard that, I sort of chuckled. So the Fed gives on one hand and takes away with the other. Look, we've had a long-term problem funding our unemployment insurance system. And part of that is understandable when you have sudden events like the recession in 2008, and all of a sudden there's a huge influx of unemployed, or the pandemic this last year and this year. maybe no system could really have enough resources to pay out money, that much money in a short period of time. Having said that, though, Ohio really does have to look at what should they have in reserve, how much money should they have, and they probably need to have more. And you don't want to have too much more, because then it'll be you'll have complaints that you're keeping too much money in the bank, if you will. But the notion that we're going to, in a sense, pay off that debt, perhaps with using money that the feds are giving us now, I think the first thing we should do is really look at the system, see how it can be improved. And the other issue that really came up was the number of, I'll use the word fraudulent applications, if you will. And I understand in a time of a pandemic, you're not going to put all the time and resources into checking every application very carefully and all of that. But we need to have better systems in place. We need to have better software, and that will take an investment. And that's always been a problem for state government. It's been a problem for the universities in terms of having systems in place provided by external vendors that really do work and get the job done. Yep. So I would hope that we would use some of the federal money, in a sense, to build our infrastructure, if you will, with respect to handling these kinds of issues, whether it's an unemployment or welfare, whatever it might be.
Mark Weaver, let me get to Mark Weaver here. Mark Weaver, we have these once-in-a-lifetime recessions about every 10 years, it seems. It always comes out of nowhere, but most recessions do. And the only way to increase the fund is either to tax businesses more or cut benefits. What's the solution to get more money into that fund for that rainy day that we know is coming at some point?
Well, Mike, you just spoke some rare common sense. The problem is, in America, too much of our budgeting and fiscal policy is driven by political science enthusiasts, and not enough is being driven by mathematics enthusiasts, because what you just said is the foundational issue. If a system is out of balance, you either need more money in or pay less money out. And there are advocates for one or the other, but the fix is going to be somewhere in the middle. And when we say the government's going to bail something out, let's remember, we're talking about our neighbors bailing ourselves out, or more typically, our neighbors' grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be bailing us out.
Jackie Borchard, where does the legislature, there is a commission that is studying the software and the system that Herb was talking about, but shockingly, they're not looking at how to properly fund the unemployment system. Where are lawmakers right now when it comes to long-term solvency, or at least half solvency of the unemployment system?
Well, it's been on their to-do list for several years. Last session, there was an effort to try to bring both of those sides together, to bring business and labor, to try to find some sort of compromise. And there were a lot of legislative hearings, and they put Kirk Schuring in charge, who's kind of the go-to person for heavy lifts, and it still didn't get done by the end of the session. The governor has renewed his call for lawmakers to kind of move that up their priority list. Right now, they're pretty occupied with the state budget, but I would expect some action to start up again on that in the fall for sure. I think, the urgency of paying back the federal government is off the table, at least this time, because of this federal stimulus, which I also chuckled at, Herb, when that was announced. I thought, is that even something that you can do? Yes, federal government will take your money and we'll just, pay it back to you for this.
With interest.
But yeah, it's something that has not been able to get done for several years, despite it being a priority. And like you said, every time we get one of these recession events, the calls kind of rise up again to do something, and nothing has gotten done.
Yeah. All right. Another week, another Republican has entered the race for U.S. Senate. This week it is Mike Gibbons. He announced he wants to succeed outgoing Senator Rob Portman. Gibbons joins Josh Mandel, Bernie Moreno, and Jane Timken as the announced candidates. Gibbons says he, and not the other three candidates, is the best to resist socialism. The Cleveland businessman ran unsuccessfully in the 2018 GOP primary. A number of Republicans are still out there, still considering running, including Congressman Steve Stivers and Mike Turner, as well as author J.D. Vance. Mark Weaver, Mike Gibbons, is he the guy who's going to carry the Trump banner to a primary victory?
Kind of feels like the flavor of the week, doesn't he? I mean, we almost have a baseball team of announced candidates. There will be probably, I'm sorry, a basketball team. There'll be a baseball team before we know it. There'll be 9. This will be a crowded primary. There's the folks who already announced have one thing in common. They don't have an office to defend in re-election. Some of the names you mentioned do. One of my clients, Congressman Bill Johnson from Eastern Ohio, the strongest Trump district in the state, he's looking at this closely. This will be a crowded primary. And when I've advised statewide candidates, and for example, Rob Portman was a client, I advised him, I will often tell them the more crowded the primary, the more difficult it is to predict who gets through, because the percentage of the vote that you need to win in a crowded primary could be as little as 24, 25%. And so right now it's a money primary, and it's folks trying to get closer to Trump world to show their Trump bona fides, much like Democrat candidates love to show their Obama bona fides in a Democrat primary. That's where we are right now.
J.D. Vance, he's making a lot of noise on Twitter. He left his job at a foundation, I guess, perhaps because of the Twitter statements that he's made, perhaps because he's considering a run for Senate here in Ohio. Is he a real possibility of entering this race, the author?
I think you have to keep an eye on anybody who has personal wealth that they can spend. Some candidates have it and won't spend it. That's a big difference. And he also has a $10 million super PAC out there that's helping him. So you can't take your eye off someone like that. Having said that, he's somewhat inscrutable. No one quite knows whether he's the wealthy techno guy who went to Yale Law School, or whether he's the guy who's from Southwest Ohio and wrote Hillbilly Elegy, and maybe he says he's both. But right now, I think voters still scratch their head and wonder exactly who he is.
Herb Asher, you've watched Ohio politics for a long time. Do you see a guy like Steve Stivers taking that risk, giving up his congressional seat to take a stab at the Senate race?
He's publicly made it very clear that if he thought there was a lane in which he could run as the traditional conservative candidate, not anti-Trump, but certainly not one of the Trumpsters per se, and he saw these other candidates all splitting the same pool of voters, he might very well jump in. But as Mark said, if he has the money, if he really has the opportunity to wage a good campaign. But he said that publicly.
Yeah.
As to J.D. Vance, I think ultimately there'll be less there than meets the eye. Hillbilly Elegy was, certainly recognized as a very fascinating and interesting book. When you actually get down to it and what he has to say about our residents of rural Ohio, it's actually not a particularly sympathetic or supportive book or whatever. And I think at some point there'll be selective quotes that will be used, if he's a candidate, about what he's had to say about the residents of rural Ohio.
Yeah.
And those are very Trump areas.
Yeah. Jackie Borchard, meanwhile, no Democrats have announced officially they're running. Is there action going on behind the scenes where they're trying to coalesce behind a candidate? I'm thinking about, Tim Ryan and Nan Whaley, two of the probably the most prominent Democrats considering runs for Senate or governor. Are there any noise that they're working out something behind closed doors?
I don't know so much about working things out in that sense, but there's definitely discussions amongst the different groups within the Democratic Party about what kind of candidate they want to have in as their nominee. I think up until Rob Portman had announced his retirement, which was a surprise to almost everybody, that seat, that spot on the Democratic side was seen as sort of a sacrificial lamb, so to speak. And at this point now, with an open seat and looking at the way that the Republican side of things is stacking up, it's looking at maybe, something that isn't just a throwaway, that they could have a chance to at least, to win or to, have a solid footing on it and build a solid ticket for 2022 with the rest of the statewide. So I think there's a lot of discussion amongst different factions of the party of who that might be. Of course, there are also those statewide seats, and some people have expressed interest in both of those, including, Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley has said she's interested in the governor's race as well as the Senate race. Tim Ryan has said he's running for everything at one point or another, but he is one who is working behind the scenes to build some endorsements, and people close to him expect that he will announce a Senate run and not a governor's run.
Yeah.
But there's certainly other names out there that have been thrown out. Amelia Sykes, the House Minority Leader from Akron, and Kevin Boyce in Columbus. it's still, I think, seen as fairly open, especially since no one has officially announced.
Yeah. Okay, our last topic, the latest police shooting of a black man prompted a new series of protests in downtown Columbus this week. They were much smaller than last year's events. Some Republican lawmakers want to tighten the rules on protests and toughen penalties for civil disobedience. Supporters of the bill say they are necessary to protect the public, police, and other first responders. Critics say the bills unnecessarily infringe on First Amendment rights. Jackie Borchert, I'm just guessing here, but I'm thinking that the Republican lawmakers of the State House saw what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, and they say we can't have that happening at the State House, and that's why they're pushing this legislation, right?
Sure. I think most of it is coming from the protests from last summer.
Oh, okay.
And in the last session, but I think that's, that's part of the conversation too, because in Ohio, we had our own situation where, some windows were broken at the State House, at our seat of government. And there was a bill last year already to kind of get the ball rolling on this. But this is a national trend that we're seeing also in Ohio. This idea that, the protests last year were, very lawless and violent, and we need more penalties or stiffer penalties to kind of rein that in. And in Ohio, we have 4 bills that would, in one way or another, do one of those things, either create new penalties around protests, for example, make it a crime to block traffic during a protest. And that's something that we've seen at several protests in Ohio over the years. Either intentional, like up in Cleveland after Tamir Rice was killed, yep, or last summer in Columbus, it seemed it was more of that's where people were being pushed, was into the street because there were so many people gathered downtown. Anyway, free speech advocates are raising all sorts of red flags about some of these details, including some conservatives who say that these extra penalties are not needed.
Mark Weaver, you're a big defender, advocate for First Amendment rights. Where is that line? Can you block a street? You can't break a window. That's a crime now. But can you block a street? Where do we need more rules on the books for these protests?
I don't think we need more rules. The First Amendment allows peaceable assembly. And the moment you break the law, you should be arrested. Every rock thrown is a crime. Arrest that person. Every time someone's hit, every window broken is a crime. Arrest that person. It's already a crime to have a pedestrian in a roadway. It's a minor misdemeanor. I suppose you could make that more serious. But if you don't have prosecutors who are willing to bring charges now when people throw bricks and rocks at police or break windows of private business owners who spent their hard-earned money to open a business, if you won't have a prosecutor who will charge those obvious crimes, it's hard to imagine that a new statute is going to allow prosecutors, going to encourage prosecutors to prosecute new crimes.
Herb Asher, civil disobedience means you're disobeying and probably breaking the law. Should they do things like, block traffic or chain themselves to fences or entrances or break into a police station? Shouldn't they expect to be arrested, or do they think that they should be able to just go away and not worry about it?
There was once a time where, in fact, protesters expected to be arrested. And that was really part of the nobility of their cause, if you will, that they would actually pay the penalty. That really went back into the old civil rights movement. I think Mark is right in saying, look, enforce the current laws, enforce them wisely. Don't stand down overly, because you're going to then have greater problems and greater disrespect for the law. I thought the Senate president actually summarized it very nicely when he expressed the skepticism, saying we already have laws in place, and the more behavior we criminalize, or if we start upgrading existing violations to, let's say, felonies, then we're really actually creating many more problems in terms of people's lives. So,
all right, we got to get to our off-the-record final thoughts, and we will start with Mark Weaver. Your final thought.
It's a little bit related to what we just talked about. In my trainings around the state, I talked to a lot of police officers, hundreds over periods of months, and many of them are counting the days to retirement or looking for other jobs. What's happening in America is driving good police out of the departments, and they're going to have to be replaced by somebody. And we all know the old saying, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It could make our communities very dangerous if we lose our police officers.
Herb Asher, final thought.
I think Columbus leadership needs to focus more attention now on the future viability of the downtown area, economically, socially, a whole variety of things. Offices are not going to be refilled. Small businesses are still hurting. The whole notion of homeless and all those things really hurt the viability of the downtown.
Yeah, I tried to find a place open for lunch today. It was hard to do. It's because the office workers aren't there and the restaurants aren't going to open up for nobody. Anyway, Jackie Borchard, your final thought.
Well, there's been lots of reports of Ohioans who were arrested because of their involvement in the Capitol riots. And you may have thought, wow, that sounds like Ohio's got a lot. Well, it turns out we have the sixth most of any state residents who were arrested and charged with crimes involving that incident. 20 Ohioans, the DOJ announced this week in total since it has been 100 days as of Friday, since January 6th.
Anyway, Bernie Moreno, who is running for U.S. Senate on the Republican side, we mentioned him earlier. He has hired Kellyanne Conway, the former White House advisor. So his campaign advisor, Bernie Moreno's campaign advisor, Kellyanne Conway, has higher name ID than he does as he begins his statewide run in Ohio. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online. We're on Facebook, on Twitter. You can watch every episode on demand at our website, wosu.org/COTR. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.